Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is my name is Michael Kaselniak. I'm the Safety Committee Chairman for the Colorado Pilots Association. And once again, we bring you Monday our safety presentation. And tonight we have Mr. Jay Turnbull, CFI out of Western Plains Flight School. Jay is going to be talking about Part 91 operations tonight. And another side topic of that, it may be legal, but is it a smart thing to do, so to speak? So I really thank Jay for coming on board and doing this for the Colorado Pilots Association. It means a lot to us, and I'll turn it over to Jay. Thank you, Jay.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Appreciate the opportunity to come speak with you guys tonight. I just want to put in a plug for Bill Staniford and Bill Dunn. I know they had kind of a tough summer this year putting on the mountain flying class. I sponsored a class in Greeley in May, on May 7th, and we had 17 attendees there, and we're going to do it again October 1st. So those of you who might have missed the opportunity to attend that wonderful class or re-attend it, as I did, I think it's been 5 years since I attended it, and I learned so much going back again. So we're putting that on again October 1st, which is Saturday. And I haven't even advertised it. We got 10 people already signed up, so we've about half filled the class. So that's great. Just get a hold of myself or Bill Stanford or Bill Dunn. Marty Brophy would know, if you get a hold of him. I fly with Marty quite a bit, so we're good friends. I helped him get his instrument rating recently. The basis of my talk, my primary teaching as a CFI in the last 6 years has been preparing, training, and getting CFIs ready. And I've probably gotten over 250 of them ready in the last 6 years. So average about 4 to 5 a month. So so I go through the FAR a lot, and from cover to cover, as a matter of fact. My current issue is in 2 pieces because it's fallen apart already. So I'm waiting for the new edition to come out. But about a month and a half ago, Brian Richardson, who is the Denver Visto safety director, stopped by, and we had a nice long chat and caught up. And I said, Brian, what are your big concerns? He said, well, and I mentioned to him because we had talked previously the year before about the safety issues in the FSDOs, that the Denver FSDO had the worst safety record of any quarter in 2020. Now we think back to 2020 and what happened. We all know COVID. We stopped flying on a regular basis in the fall. We didn't pick up flying again till March, and oh my gosh, what happened? The doors slammed shut because COVID hit, and everybody stayed inside. So people didn't wander back out till about the middle of June. And when they did wander out, they hadn't been flying for over 6 months, and they started cracking up, and nothing, not too many serious things like we've had recently. Unfortunately, we've had a couple of pretty serious things. I don't keep up with all of them, but he said, this lack of flying is really hurting us a lot. And I think we can all look at each other and say, yeah, even now with the high price of fuel and things like that, it tends to put a damper on us wanting to fly as much. Well, that is hurting our safety record. There was 2 days in the third quarter of 2020 where we had 3 accidents a day in the Denver FSDO. And that's a lot. And that's, for those of you who don't know, Denver FSDOs, all of Colorado, some of Utah, Wyoming, some goes into Montana, a little bit so pretty big FSDO. So in going over some things, I'll be talking about quite a few different things, but so I asked Brian, I said, well, what are your concerns now? And he said, once again, people being rusty because of the lack of flying. And the lack of probably challenging ourselves when we are flying. Maybe we're just going out and getting the, you know, the $200 hamburger or whatnot, but are we really challenging ourselves to hit that mark when we land? Are we practicing soft field landings? Are we practicing doing a little different things? Maybe power off 180 approaches. How about flight reviews? I did 15 flight reviews last year. 3 of them were only a year old. The guys got with me, said, "Hey, I've only flown a couple hours this past year. I want to make this a flight review." Well, you still have another year. He said, "No, I still want to make this a flight review." They insisted. I said, "That's great. I think that's what the FAA would like to hear. They'd like to hear us all saying, well, you know, I'm pretty rusty. Why don't I just go ahead and get another flight review?" So I've been advocating that for myself as well as anybody else. And then as I'm flying, I run into situations that happen, and then I go through the Part 91 every month and talking about things that are legal but not necessarily safe. And I want to go over a bunch of those. That's the topic, or at least the theme I built this around, but I'll be wandering around. I want to start with a couple of things. And I'd pull. I'm not. What am I technically? I'm technically challenged, so I'm not going to be able to pull these regs up, but I'll be reading them to you if you want to follow along. I'm going to start in 9113, which is careless and reckless operation. That is kind of a catch-all regulation that the FAA would throw at us if we violated some other regulations, like maybe we violated a entry into a pattern, or we busted airspace. And that's, as a matter of fact, busting Bravo airspace is the primarily Bravo, but Charlie and Delta also is one of is the leading area that we're violating the most, which for the most part isn't all that dangerous, but the TRACON sure thinks so. And I have to appreciate that. So this is one that they'll throw at us for being careless or reckless, in addition to busting that airspace. Alcohol and drugs. I go over this all the time with my young flight instructor students, and they always talk about, well, it's 8 hours between bottle to throttle and 0.04 on the alcohol content, but they disregard the number two, number two, which is while under the influence of alcohol or while using any drug that affects a person's faculties. While under the influence, Drew Chaitia, a good friend of mine, we've talked about this quite a bit, and he's written about it in his Aviator's Bathroom Reader's Guide. If anybody's not seen that, that's a lot of fun. He just published the second volume of that. Drew can be found around the CFO airport most any time. But under the influence of alcohol, think about this, because really sometimes, especially if somebody is a heavy drinker, that sometimes the day after they're a lot more dangerous than they are when they're actually drinking. And the other is while under the influence of drugs. In a lot of case studies from the NTSB, the findings when they do blood samples of deceased crew members, they'll find Benadryl in their system 45% of the time. You know, just something as simple as Benadryl, over the counter drug, which really affects our faculties. And a lot of those guys, especially the 135 operators, they operate on some pretty long hours and operate in pretty fatigued conditions. So they don't need to, anything like that is going to make them even less so alert. right away, pre-flight 103, pre-flight action. This is one that I just catch people not doing very well. Just 2 days ago, it was yesterday, I had a renter come to rent one of our airplanes, and when they got back, and the instructor, when they got back, the instructor called me and said, well, we put 23 gallons in that airplane, which we only flew it for 0.8 of an hour. We should have only put maybe 8 or 9 gallons in at the most. And I said, do you know where the fuel was when you did the pre-flight? And he said, well, it was at tabs, which would have been 36 gallons. But I challenged him. I said, well, the last flight on that one was done at night, and they didn't fill it up, because the school policy is to go ahead and replenish the fuel to tabs after you fly. And but it had flown at night, and the FBO at Greeley is closed after 8 o'clock at night. So it had not been fueled. I calculated there's 20 gallons in the airplane at the time, and the pilot said that he had 36. Well, this is pretty poor pre-flight. Obviously, you've got to check that quantity, and so this pilot obviously didn't do it. How often does this happen? It happens a lot. It happens a lot. I mean, I used to see it back in the days when I was living in Nebraska. People trying to fly. There was a couple of airports in the center of Lexington, in particular, that had the cheapest fuel around, and people were stretch their legs to try to get there to get that cheap fuel. And I know a Cherokee ran out of fuel a mile and a half short of the airport. But are we really being smart about this? And we're going to talk about minimum fuel in a little bit when we get to that. But but pre-flight, this is what it's all about. And 91103 is very specific about pre-flight, and that's just one instance. And it says that each pilot command shall, before beginning a flight, become familiar with all available information concerning that flight. How often do we jump on our airplanes and just do a casual, quick over? I've been teaching some classes down in Scottsdale, Arizona last winter. There's an airplane in the what they call the shades. They're just a shade cover area, and this one guy in 182, he just walks out, parks his car, jumps in the airplane, starts it up, and leaves. No pre-flight whatsoever. Unfortunately, this happens a lot, and it just makes us all look bad when things go wrong. And that's the implication here. So had this renter run out of fuel yesterday, and that would be one plane out of our inventory, possibly. He was a student pilot on a solo, and I think the implication here is that he's going to have a stern talking to about that, and make sure that he doesn't ever do that again. But another one, several months ago, I was flying into Greeley, and a corporate jet was taxiing out. The AWAS reported that runway 1735 was closed until noon for maintenance. And out goes this corporate jet, taxis out on a 35 and calls that he's going to take off. At which time maintenance saw him, and they heard that, and they picked up the mic and said, excuse me, runway's closed. Obviously, the corporate jet never even listened to the AWAS or checked the NOTAMs. They're both there. And one of the big things that Brian Richardson mentioned to me a month and a half ago when we talked was letters to airmen. Buried in the NOTAMs down at the bottom under letters to airmen. Like BJC has letters to airmen about the proximity of airplanes on the left and right runways. So you might want to dig that up and read that if you haven't already seen that. And so the people are neglecting looking at that when they look at the NOTAMs. And we run into this a lot at some of the smaller airports where or non-towered airports, especially where corporate jets are flying in, and they're handed off by TRACON fairly short in. They haven't listened to AWAS, and they haven't been listening or monitoring traffic. So they bust into a pattern at 10 miles at 150 knots, and it becomes mayhem for a little bit there sometime. And especially if they don't announce that they're a jet. Like I had one night that he just called himself a Cessna and called 10-mile final, and then a minute later called a 5-mile final. And I said, "What kind of Cessna are you, sir?" And oh, where's citation? I said, "Gee, it would really be nice to know that, sir." So we can let you have the right of way. That's generally what most people will do, is let them have the right of way. Another one that happened about a month ago, once again at Greeley, somebody, we were using runway 17, and there was a couple of airplanes using it, and in the pattern, and another airplane came in on 35 and did a touch and go and left without any radio calls whatsoever. And one gentleman on final for 17 got irate on the radio, yelling at this other airplane. He even knew that he was looking at it on his ADSB and yelling at him. And it was like, "Excuse me, sir, but I didn't say anything, but you don't have to have a radio to operate at class Golf or Echo airspace, And so it behooves us to be really on our toes, watching everything. It's wonderful to have the ADSB traffic. If you have it, use it, but don't get your eyes locked on it, because not everybody has it. It's not required in uncontrolled airspace. So pre-flight action is one that I see people violating a lot. So that's 91103. I want to review that one more time. That I would encourage you to do that. Right of way rules, 91113. I think we're all pretty much familiar with that. But it always is a good idea to review it. Obviously, anybody in distress has a right of way. Sometimes people are a little reluctant to declare an emergency when they need help or they're in a dire situation, myself included. And I think we should get rid of that notion. And if we've got a problem, we need to tell people about it and get all the help we can, and at least get the right of way and get on the ground and figure out what's going on. The next one I wanted to cover would be minimum safe altitude. I talked to all of my students about this minimum safe altitude. We're out flying in practice areas. This is more as an instructor. We're always out doing some kind of practicing, but it's always another thing that we can be doing is challenging ourselves. What airspace are we in right now? Are we in controlled airspace or are we not? What is our minimum altitude? Most people know, not actually, most people forget. When I give flight reviews, a lot of people forget that the minimum altitude over congested area is 1,000 feet AGL above the highest obstacle, 2,000 feet horizontally. Yeah, that's pretty low over non-congested areas. No persons or property in sight. We can be with no closer than 500 feet from persons or property. If we're over lake, we could be at 10 feet if we wanted to be, if we're stupid enough to do that. But not the best thinking in the world. We just have to be 500 feet from a boat or a person. The one thing we forget about on these minimum safe altitudes is 91119 says in alpha, anywhere, an altitude allowing, if the power unit fails, emergency landing without undue hazard to persons or property on the surface. What's the FAA saying here? They're saying they don't care what happens to you and me. They care what happens to people on the ground. They don't want us injuring anybody on the ground. Okay, all right, that's fine. When I flew out of northern Colorado quite a bit, lots of times our entry would be over Fort Collins, and flying over Fort Collins at 1,000 feet AGL, I would usually instigate an engine failure for my student, and at that point in time, and say, "Where are you going?" And all of a sudden they realize that they're not high enough to glide to a safe place to land because they're right over main city. This is sometimes we we need to be thinking about that a whole lot more. And a little more altitude is a smart thing to have. So this regulation, 1,000 feet AGL above the highest obstacle, in lots of cases is not right. I did a lot of photo work down over Denver and near Parker. We do photo about once a week for a couple 3 years. Come down and we would do photo shoots at 1,400 feet AGL, and I tell you, I was probably busier trying to decide where I'm going to go if my engine, if my power unit fails, than anything else. Looking at all the different parks and golf courses, and this, that, and the other, and because I never really was very close to an airport, close enough to where I could probably glide at 1,500 feet AGL. So it's something that comes to mind. Taking off from congested airports. Scottsdale, Arizona is one. Cheyenne is another. There's just no place to go. In a lot of these airports, and the best thing to do is be thinking in terms of maximum climb. The airspeed is our another thing that Drew Chaitia taught me was airspeed's our friend, but altitude is our life insurance. So if you're taking off no flaps and climbing at a cruise power or cruise speed, you might want to rethink climbing at best rate of climb, VY, until you get at least above pattern altitude. That's the recommendation in the aim to do that. And I think that if we're not doing that, it behooves us to do it. I instigated at our flying school several years ago, takeoffs with flaps always in the Skyhawks. A lot of the Skyhawk manuals call for 10 degrees flaps for takeoff. The Sky Lanes call for 20 degrees on takeoff. And they say, and some of the POHs will say that it's preferred. And thinking about the operations of the school, I thought, well, where people have the most accidents are on the ground. They lose control on the ground. They get those little tires and wheels turning really, really fast on the ground, and they're relying on that nose wheel steering when it's like pushing a wheelbarrow at 30 miles an hour, and you hit a little bump, and the wheelbarrow goes one way and you go the other way. I think about that, and so I also instigated encouraging soft field takeoffs to get that nose wheel off the ground as soon as you have control of that airplane and you have rudder control. By doing so, I extended the life of our nose gear tires by about double. We weren't changing them near as often. And the same thing with the main. We got off the ground quicker because we were using flaps and getting airborne quicker. So, and we were in more positive control of that rather than on the ground trying to make those little wheels keep our airplanes going. I see a lot of people letting after they touch down too, it just almost releasing that control wheel or that stick and letting that nose smack on down. And that's pretty hard on that nose gear assembly. We had a Cirrus last year that it bent the nose gear and of course did a prop strike, and what happened with all that called for an engine tear down and a trip over to Beagles. So think about some of these things, and it became even more evident last year when my friend Bill Snodgrass had an engine failure. He reduced the throttle and it came out in his hand, and he sat there and looked at it for the longest time, wondering, well, what's this? Why is it here? And tried to stuff it back in the panel and then the engine finally quit because it was running at such a low idle. And when he landed in what he thought was a good smooth field, and it turned out not to be, he got a little nervous about seeing a roadway coming up and a ditch, and he forced it on the ground rather than holding it off longer and landing as slow as possible, and ended up catching the prop and flipping over and did a lot of damage to his leg. And And the next month, another friend of mine in Alaska was flying down a creek bed in Alaska at about 100 feet. Don't know why it was so low, in a Cub, and the air just went out from underneath him, and he just went straight down, landed in the creek bed, caught and flipped over, and the same thing happened to him. Same damage, same injuries. Fortunately, the creek wasn't very deep, and he had 2 other guys with him, and they pulled him out of the cockpit. But these are things to think about, and part of what I'm talking about and challenge ourselves is we're having too many accidents in the landing and takeoff phase, and which could be avoided if we think about our technique and maybe try something a little bit different. So minimum safe altitudes we talked about, and then the biggest one that Brian talked to me about is 91-126. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that, 91-126 is operations at Class Golf airports, or operating on the vicinity of an airport in Class Golf airspace. That specifically says, in general, unless otherwise authorized or required, each person operating an aircraft on or in the vicinity of an airport in Class Golf airspace must comply with the requirements of this section. Bravo says direction of turns. When approaching to land at the airport without an operating control tower in Class Golf airspace, each pilot of the airplane must make all turns of that airplane to the left unless the airport displays approved light signals or visual markings indicating that turns should be made to the right, in which case the pilot should make all turns to the right. And then it talks about helicopters and flap settings and communication with the control tower should there be one. Well, I've only found one at a Gulf airport that has a very, very infrequently operating control tower, but so I don't think you're gonna have to worry about that too much. But the point here is, I get out I get over to Greeley Airport in particular on early, especially on a Saturday morning, when it tends to be fairly busy. And within the first hour, I could pull the tickets of at least 3 people because they're not operating the pattern properly. They're making the turns in the wrong direction. They're turning too low. They're operating in a careless and reckless manner. This is an ongoing, and this is why Brian Richardson from the FISDO was even at Greeley Airport a month and a half ago, because they've started bringing their team up there, supposedly unannounced, and setting up house and watching operations there because they've had so many complaints. The other airport that's had so many complaints, going to have to help me here. It's K-Fly down by Colorado Springs. What's the name of that one? Oh, what's the name of that one?
I believe it's Meadowbrook.
Oh, yeah, Meadow Lake.
Meadow Lake.
Meadow Lake.
Meadow Lake, yeah. Meadow Lake's another one that a lot of complaints. And so the FISDO is going to be watching both of those airports very closely. They've just been watching and doing some occasional ramp checks at Greeley. I think they've been there about 3 times in the last 2.5 months or so. The only thing that I think they caught somebody on an expired medical. They're not there to slap hands or cause a lot of trouble, but they're just monitoring. But they're gonna start stepping it up, because the complaints are still coming in. People are still coming in and making right entries on left-hand patterns, and vice versa. And everybody, and that particular airport has 4 runways, and the locals and others tend to use all 4 of them at the same time, and I've got to say there's been an awful lot of luck up there that we haven't had any accidents, but the situation I described earlier about somebody landing on an opposing runway happens all too often, and is not a safe thing. And if people are not flying according to this regulation 91-126 and making those turns in the correct direction, if we're flying in or trying to fly out of there, it's kind of a shit show as to where we're going to find people flying. And so it just makes it all the more less safe. And the FSDO is going to start cracking down. So just word of the wise, the 127 is the same thing. It's on class Echo airspace. And then it says class Echo, we need to do exactly what 91-126 said, the direction of turn. I had an instructor once that made a right-hand entry into the pattern at Northern Colorado. And I challenged him on that. I said, this is left-hand pattern. You just broke the regs. He said, well, but there's an AC 66 Bravo. And I said, yeah, I'm very familiar with it. It says it's only recommended that we make left turns if it's a left pattern or right turns for the right pattern. And I said, well, that's well and good. And the AIM does also. If you look at the AIM, it says it's recommended. But my point was that the FARs, the regulation, Part 91, out trumps any AC advisory circular or anything the AIM says. Okay, so when he continued to do that, I sought for his quick relief dismissal from operation because he continued to do that. He's a flight instructor. He's teaching students. He's teaching them it's okay. You know, it just is terribly, just it's totally wrong. Totally wrong. How are we doing on time there? About 15 minutes. Yeah.
Doing great.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. So we talked about fuel a little bit. That's 91-151. That's minimum fuel requirements for VFR operation. So I think we all know that the minimum fuel requirements for VFR conditions, no person may begin a flight in an airplane under VFR conditions unless considering wind and local forecast weather condition, there's enough fuel to fly to the first point of intended landing in, assuming normal cruising speed during the day, fly after that for at least 30 minutes or at night for 45 minutes. Well, let's think about this. Let's just take a simple airplane like a Skylane and say, what does half an hour of fuel look like? That would be approximately 8 gallons, with a little extra there for unusable. What's that going to look like on the fuel tanks, on the fuel gauges? About 3 to 4 gallons on each side. Do you trust those fuel tanks or those fuel gauges to be accurate? Some of these airplanes are fairly old, and boy, I sure wouldn't trust them. So, in thinking about this, and fuel exhaust should just never happen to us. It shouldn't be happening to us at all. But it continues to happen on a regular basis. And this 30 minutes, yeah, it's legal, but this is where I really, stick the needle in, say, is it really safe? You really want to do this? What are your personal minimum? I think we need to revisit our personal minimums all the time. The older I get, I revisit my personal minimums a lot. So it's a matter of big concern. So fuel quantity, at least double. Once again, another quote from Drew Chaitia. You never have enough fuel unless you're on fire, and that's about it. So so that's enough said about fuel. And then 155. Here's another one. This one is, and I wouldn't be surprised if maybe some of you will remember this, but 91-155 is basic VFR weather minimum. And then the infamous chart about what the visibility and cloud clearance is in all different airspaces at different times of the day or night. And then Bravo in this section talks about class Gulf airspace, and Bravo 2 says that the airplane can operate at an airport if the visibility is less than 3 statute miles at night remember now, the nighttime visibility requirements in class golf airspace is 3 statute miles, and it's 152, 1,000 feet below the clouds, 500 feet above, and 2,000 feet horizontally. But at night, the regs tell us that we can operate within 1/2 mile of an airport runway with 1 statute miles of visibility. Once again, this is night hours. As long as we stay within 1/2 mile of the runway, you can operate and do that. You can go out and practice touch and go landings at night in the clouds with 1 mile visibility. And that's something that anybody, and hopefully nobody in this group would ever even attempt to do that. But you could do it at BJC at night after the tower closes. You sure could, because what does BJC's airspace go to after the tower closes? It doesn't go to Echo. It goes to golf. Same thing for FO, for the old Front Range now, Spaceport. Same thing. It goes to golf also. Why is that? It's under the Bravo. Tracon doesn't want to have anything to do with it, so I think they just say, or we'll just make them Bravo. Same thing happens in Scottsdale, where it's under the Phoenix Bravo. The Scottsdale tower closes at 10 o'clock at night, and it goes to golf after hours. So we could legally go out after 10 o'clock at night at BJC and practice our takeoff and landings with 1 mile visibility and stay clear of clouds if we stay within 1/2 mile of the runway. Let me know if you do that. I'd like to kind of watch you on FlightAware, see if you make it. But no, please don't do that. Sorry. Okay. There's most of the rest of the information in 91 is about IFR operations. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about stable approaches. And I think this is where a lot of us are possibly getting ourselves into trouble. Making these approaches and stable approaches, and for airlines, airline has to be, as far as at least some of my airline friends have told me a few years ago, that the stable approach for them, if they weren't stable at 1,000 feet, that's on center line, on glide slope, on speed, at 1,000 feet final, there was a go around. And the last thing an airline captain wants to do is have to go around, because then he has to answer to the company, why did you go around and spend all that money and mess up our arrival time, et cetera, et cetera. So the list goes on. For the FAA generally will say, and this is what I know Brian Richardson has said, for us in general aviation, 500 feet, if we're not stable at 500 feet, that's normally when we're turning final from base. If we're in the pattern, if we're not stable at that point, on speed, on glide slope, and lined up, it's an automatic go around. I try to teach my students that no landing has to be done unless you're out of fuel or on fire. Every approach should be an option approach for us, and if we're not stable, then we need to go around. I always teach my students the first approach is a practice approach. I tell them it's just like the first pancake we make that we pour into the pan when we're making pancakes in the morning. It's the one we use to season the pan with, and then we throw that to the dog, and then we start cooking the ones we're going to eat. And the same thing is true of that first approach, that they need to just come on down, do a low approach, and if it feels okay, then you continue with it. If not, then go around and get a good feeling for what those winds are doing down to the surface. The winds in Colorado along the Front Range, you all know, they're so dynamic, and they change so frequently and so regularly. Was it 3 years ago, 2019, in September? The first week in September, we had 8 microbursts at the Northern Colorado Regional Airport. 8 microbursts pass over the field. I was at the end of the runway when one of those came. Everyone else was leery about flying, and I'm always one I'll put my toes in the water and test it. So me and a CFI student went out, and we were sitting at the end of the runway, and a Skylane came in, and all of a sudden a microburst hit the end of the runway. My regret is I didn't jump on the mic and yell, "Microburst, microburst, go around, go around." We watched him. He got into the microburst. The plane started doing lots of ups and downs as it was flying through the headwind and then the tailwind and the downburst. It's kind of a scary thing. If you but when you've got a little extra time, you need to go to the back of the FAR AIM to the pilot controller glossary. But the very last thing is the index where we look up answers. But if you go and look up if you haven't read the pilot controller glossary, and I had not done that, probably did it about 5 years ago, and it just opened my eyes. There are so many things to find in here, and so many things talked about, and so many things about the language we should be using between the pilot and controller. And let me read the definition of a microburst in the back in the pilot controller glossary. It says small downburst with outbursts of damaging winds extending 2.5 miles or less. So it's pretty narrow, pretty small in size. In spite of the small horizontal scale, an intense microburst could induce wind speeds as high as 150 knots. That is scary. Most microbursts could have a wind shear of 90 knots, 45 headwind going into it and 45 tailwind going out of it. Now you think about our approach speeds. If we're coming in at 75, 80 knots, and we've got a 45 knot change in airspeed, all of a sudden, just think of what that 80 knots turns into about 35 knots when we hit that when we catch the tailwind. We're going to be I don't know how else to say it, assholes and elbows to try to keep ourselves afloat, from going down. So when the gentleman in the Skylane had never experienced a microburst, never seen one, and he started cycling his gear. He was blown off the runway about 50 feet up at 50 feet AGL. He flew down the runway. He had retracted his gear, and then he realized he might get thrown into the ground. So he extended the gear again, which probably was a mistake because he had induced more drag. But I yelled, "Airspeed, airspeed, fly your airspeed," and over the radio. And he said that woke him up, and he just realized what he needed to do at that time. I think, this is the biggest thing. We get distracted, and we get thrown a curveball, and we don't quite know what to do. So obviously maintaining flying attitude. You always fly. One more thing, Drew Chaitia taught me, you always fly the airplane to the crash. We watched him go down the runway, or no, he wasn't even over the runway, off about 100 feet or so off the runway, but 50 feet. He went down, hit another microburst down near the end, and then we saw him disappear off the north end. He was making the approach to 3-3, so he's on a northwest heading. He disappeared off the end and went below the trees that were on the north end of Northern Colorado's runway. And the next thing we thought we were going to be seeing was black smoke. When, thank goodness, we were holding our breath, and we saw him come up from out of the trees, and he made it. He found out who I was. Actually, we had a video of it too. One of my other instructors had been videoing the whole thing, and showed that to him, and had a long talk with him about microbursts. So we started educating our students right away about microbursts. It was a good thing. We had 7 more that week. So this is something that you need to become familiar with in Virga. And this is another great thing about the mountain flying class. Bill and Bill talk about weather phenomena just like this all the time. And you can never know enough, and you never learn enough. My philosophy in flying is, if I haven't learned something new today, I wasn't paying attention. So obviously you guys aren't flying every day necessarily, but like I am, or in that environment every day, but every day I am in that environment, I'm trying to learn something new. And I think that'd be my biggest challenge to you, would be to to challenge yourself to learn something new on a regular basis, and to challenge yourself in flying. Look at the ways you've been flying, and maybe think about, hey, maybe I ought to start using flaps now. I started off my primary students using 10 degrees flaps in a Skyhawk or a Cherokee, because when they go to the airlines, if that's where they're going, and most of them are, they're going to be using flaps to take off with. Why not start them from the get-go? First, from day one, the law of primacy, start with them using flaps for every takeoff they make. Then when they go to the airlines, it's going to be same old, same old. It'll be just like that GUMPS checklist. It's the same thing every single time. So I don't know, does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask me? Because I'm basically out of time, but I'd certainly be open to a question or two if that's the way you do things, Michael.
Yeah, no, I have a question for you, Jay. You caught me off guard on the 10 degrees of flaps on the Skyhawk for takeoff. I've never been taught that.
Yep.
Never
And
been
you
taught.
look at your POH. It might, well, not all of them say that. The older models don't. The newer models do. It says 10 degrees preferred. 0 to 10, 10 degrees preferred.
Okay.
I would recommend doing that. You do not get a hardly any penalty in drag with 10 degrees of flaps in a sky. The main thing you get is extra lift, and you'll know that when you're coming into land. If you're my immediate being my landing point, it's power to idle, 10 degrees flaps right away, and I get to my best glide speed. But that airplane will rise when you extend that 10 degrees of flaps, all that extra lift it gets. So it almost no drag with 10 degrees of flap. And those of you who have sky lanes, or in particular 140 for 10 degrees of flaps, help you slow down. And a lot of your other airplanes. What's the Bonanza one? I've forgotten now. I haven't flown one for a while. I think it's 150 for half flaps, and then 120 for full flaps. I'm not positive. You correct me if I'm wrong. But it's something like that. So that if it's 2 degrees, cirruses are that way. The half flaps at I believe it's 125. So maybe it's even more than that. No, I believe it's on 150. Come to think of it, cirrus is 150 at half flaps, and then full flaps at about 100, 110 or under 120.
Okay, and I made another note here about in that same vein, soft field takeoff. So you got your 10 degrees of flaps, and you're keeping the weight off the front wheel. Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Of course, then you're going to take off sooner. You're going to take off before you really have flying speed, so you have to stay in ground effect.
Right.
But the beauty of these airplanes is that there's so little drag in ground effect that they'll fly at 35 and 40 knots, in ground effect, and that's where you sit there and accelerate, and those wheels aren't spinning, and you've got full authority with your ailerons and your rudder, and your elevator.
I fly with the Aspen Flying Club, and a couple of years back they instituted a yearly flight review.
Not bad. I think that's a great idea. I think more schools ought to do that too. Yeah. Have you been negative? I mean, has that been a positive thing for you? Have you been in or are you don't like it?
I like it. In fact, the last flight review I did one from AOPA where it was the in-depth one, and the instructor was kind of surprised that I wanted to go through the whole. It was like 3 pages worth of stuff, and we did it over a course of 3 weekends, and he was kind of shocked that I wanted to do it so in depth. But
well, I applaud you then, because I think more of us need to be doing that.
Yeah. And then you were talking about Greeley. That's interesting you bring that up, because there's been a discussion between DOT, the Aeronautics Division, and the FAA, and we were told in the last email, AOPA, there's been a lot of discussion about people not following the regs at Greeley.
Yep.
And the DOT Aeronautics Division is trying to put a one-day symposium together here in the future to address this with the flying community up in the Greeley area. And Hetty Carlson is heading that up. I don't know where it's at right now. I did contact her last week, and I was still in the talking stages.
Yeah,
but
I might talk with Dave about that and see where he's thinking. See if anything. I'm always on top of that, trying to nip stuff in the bud. It's not just the locals at Greeley. It's a lot of the people that are coming in from around the area also that come in there. So I can't throw all the blame at just the locals in Greeley. There's enough problems there already, but there's so many people that come in from out of the area that because we got the restaurant on the field, they're coming in for the hamburger, or stuff like that.
Yeah. When you talked about fuel gauges, I remember the old story I was told had read, the only time the fuel gauges are accurate is when they're reading 0.
Yep, that's right. Yep, that's exactly right.
Okay.
Well, I hope Dave Ulane with the Aeronautics Board, I hope they and the FSO get really active on doing that. And I think they're going to go down to K-Fly also and probably do the same thing. They're getting concerned, and it's. I sure hope it happens before an accident happens.
Right.
So.
Yeah, we've reached out to them. The Colorado Pilots Association would like to be involved and help in any way to bring that symposium to fruition. Hopefully.
Good. Well,
okay.
I'm always on board to help out with that too. So.
Okay.
So I thought it was Mike, if you're done, I have a few comments.
Yep.
I thought it was interesting on the 10 degrees of flaps because I have an unusual flying history where I didn't start flying Cessna 172s until I was about 750 hours into my flying time. So I almost had no Cessna time, and then I moved over to a flight club that had 2 172s, and I just I've been flying low wings and Pipers and things like that, so the first notch of flaps is pretty common, and so I just carried that over to the 172, and I like how fast it pops off the runway, but flying out of Metro, there's plenty of runway, so it's sort of like 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, but I'm comfortable with either the 10 degrees or 0 degrees, but I do like it popping a lot faster. The other one that I thought was kind of funny is my biggest problem is remembering the minimums, not because they're difficult to remember, but my attitude on flying is those are the minimum numbers. My minimum is higher than that. So I know where my minimums are at, but when I go get quizzed on it, it's sort of like, well, I know what my minimums are, but I'm not really sure what the actual minimums are. So I always have to go brush up on that.
And but see, you're safer already because I'm applauding you if your minimums are higher than that. I'm already applauding you because you've already building yourself a cushion of safety.
Right.
So.
Yeah, there was a guy that commented on one of the forums the other day where it was his 3rd solo flight, and he had I forget what the problem was. I know what it was. He had a pitot bug get in the static tube or the pitot tube, and so he had no airspeed indicator. That wouldn't be that would make me uncomfortable, but it wouldn't be a deal killer. I mean, I'd come back in and land, but a 3rd solo probably is a bigger issue. And one of the things that he walked through was that he climbed up to 600 feet, didn't want to go any higher, and he had some reasons for not going higher, which the general consensus was, okay, well that's good, but my comment to him was, hey, look, altitude is your friend, and if you're that new of a pilot and you're trying to troubleshoot a problem at 600 feet, you are in a position where a stall spin is much more dangerous at 600 feet than you are at 1,000 feet. Yep. So, I commented to him that, climb a little bit higher. And the other comment that I wanted to make is I know firsthand flying with Drew that you fly the airplane to the scene of the accident. So,
Yep. Yep.
Because I've been there with him.
Yep. Good. Well, unfortunately, he's not a DP anymore, but he's
Yeah, I
still
heard
around.
that.
So so he's down at Peterson Air Force Flying Club.
Okay.
And so that's good. So he's still involved. He's still trying to get his medical back. Unfortunately, he's having trouble getting that moment.
Where do you instruct out of?
Greeley.
Okay.
Western Plains Flight School in Greeley.
Okay.
It's been a small school there for a long time, but never been really organized until this past year. So it's got a little more teeth to it now.
Right. I'd imagine learning to fly at Greeley's with all the different directions traffic can come in there.
Well, it's interesting you say that because when Northern Colorado, I was flying over there most of the time when it went with the tower, then that's all well and good. But I always have wondered, and I don't know if anybody has any input with what's best to learn at a non-towered airport or a towered airport. And I think it's a lot harder to learn at a non-towered airport because you have to make all the calls and be looking out for everything yourself. You have to be totally aware of what's going on. So flying out of a non-towered airport is a lot harder. And I think if we're comfortable flying out of a towered airport, we get into our non-comfort zone when we go to the non-towered airports like Greeley or Longmont or Erie, places like that, where we have to be totally vigilant of what's going on. And it definitely behooves us that we need to, even though probably not going to get called out on it, but if we make a wrong move or a wrong turn, it may not get called out on it, but it sure could cause a lot of discomfort. Yeah,
I learned to fly at Erie, so non-towered was my first effort into flying, and I'm really super flexible as to what type of airport that I'm flying into, towered or untowered. And I've known people in my flying time that only learned at a tower, and they're just very nervous all the time flying into a non-towered airport.
Oh, definitely. Oh, that's definitely. Erie's a tough one too, because you've got that climbing terrain on the south end, which is hard. So I'm always teaching my students, you just climb at the maximum rate until you get to a good safe altitude, and that's usually pattern altitude. So we should be making VY climbs all the way to pattern altitude as a minimum. So, well,
and then you've got the terrain at the north end that has a little river running through it, and that's a really good airport to really hone your landing skills, because the visual representation on there, 1.5 or 3.3. Well, I don't know what they are right now. I think the magnetic changed on them.
They did 1.634 or something. Yeah. Is it
okay? Well, but no matter what direction you fly in on that airport, it's the visual aspect of it. I always feel high coming in on 3.4, and then I am high on 1.6. Yeah. So it doesn't really matter.
Yep. No, I'd agree with you there.
6.34.
So Jay, one of the things that we used to always practice in high performance aircraft is we would take an emergency of the day and just take one of the bold pages and practice that on each flight. And I find in general aviation they don't do that. And the first time they look at the boldface is in the emergency. And so if you get into the habit of each time you go out, practice one of those boldface, then A, you know where the switches are, and B, it's not as scary to you when you do that. And so, I think that's a good tip to give to your students.
Absolutely. Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is so important. If we don't know those boldface, we just think of Sully. He didn't know what was happening, but he reached up and turned that auxiliary power unit on. So he had that rat out there. So he had enough hydraulic power to fly the airplane and enough electric to talk to somebody. you know, had he not done that, that was an automatic thing. He just, we learned that in the Navy too, attention to detail. We had to know those emergency procedures cold. You didn't have time to think about it. So,
Absolutely. And so your talk is timely because this day in history, 87 years ago, Wiley Post and Will Rogers augured in their Lockheed Orion and near Point Barrow, Alaska. So,
wow. Yep. Good point. Very good point. Thanks for bringing that up. That was, I'm glad you brought that up. I had that in my notes also, but I didn't get to it yet.
good talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, very good. Thank you. Thank you once again, Jay. Really appreciate it. That was great. I made a lot of notes here and
Well, good. Thanks.
go through that. So
Yep.
no, good.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you.
very much.
I hope
appreciate-
I got it all right. If anybody, I was going to tell anybody that knows me out there that, you know, they know they can heckle me from the audience and remind me if I just say something wrong. So, but nobody heckled me, so I guess I'm all right.
No, very good. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you.